Story 1. I returned a VCR tape one day late. This was about 25 years ago. The tape was due on September 30th and I returned it on October 1st. The employee tried to charge me a 2-day late fee. I informed her it was only 1 day late. She insisted it was 2 days and even showed her the calendar. Her response was that it could have been a leap September. I requested to speak to her manager. After explaining the situation to the manager, she shook her head in disbelief and removed the late fee from my account. Story 2. I work in information technology at a public school. The bookkeeper is my point of contact. She is by far the least competent adult I've ever met. Since 2018, I have reminded her multiple times to use our work order system instead of emailing issues. Just last week, she did it again. When I reminded her, she said she wasn't sure if the issue required a work order, even though an entire wing of the school had lost network connection. The principal assigned her to manage the Title I funds, which could only be used for technology. She purchased $50,000 worth of printers because that is what the teachers requested. The teachers wanted color printers, which is reasonable. However, this woman never consulted me. She contacted a local printer supply company and was significantly overcharged. She bought a color printer suitable for a small office for each teacher. She also spent $1,500 on docking stations for the teachers' laptops, after my boss had already told her that we don't support those. When I asked her why she bought them, she said she didn't know what they were, and that a teacher had instructed her to purchase them. After I explained their function and reiterated that we wouldn't support them, she purchased extra monitors for the teachers. It's perplexing how her mind operates. Fortunately, we could use the monitors, but the docking stations have been sitting in a storage room for 3 years. On another occasion, she forgot her password, and when I reset it, I advised her to create a new one. She insisted that it wouldn't let her log in. The requirement for a password is 8 characters, but she was only typing in 6. When I explained what characters means, she said she didn't understand the term. I genuinely wonder how she manages to navigate everyday life without harm. Story 3. An old coworker named James and I worked at McDonald's when we were both 16. One time, while mopping the lobby, he unexpectedly decided to chase several customers around with the mop, yelling that he was going to get them. He was fired on the spot. Story 4. I don't know what was wrong with her, but she was in her 40s and struggled with basic tasks. We worked together in a food takeout booth, and she had difficulty handling cash. She often took someone's money, struggled to make change even with the total displayed on the register, and then returned both the change and the original amount to the customer. I had to calm an angry customer after this lady served 1 scoop of ice cream that was only the size of a standard metal scoop. I eventually realized she could do the least damage by washing dishes, so I assigned her that task while I managed the workload of 2 people. Story 5. I used to know a man who proudly said, "If I have to choose between paying my bills or buying a steak dinner, I'm choosing the steak dinner." I lost count of how many homes he and his equally misguided wife were evicted from. Story 6. This girl from my high school named Shauna had a room temperature IQ. Shauna spelled giraffe as draft, because that's how she pronounced it. She told us about Asia, not the continent, but the one in Europe. Shauna believed that you could die from leg pain alone without any other issues. She thought that leg pain would eventually kill someone. My personal favorite moment was during a discussion in law class when Shauna informed us that we couldn't say penis because it's a bad word. When asked what word we should use to address that body part, she suggested testicle, stating that men have 1 testicle and 2 balls. We doodled a picture and had her label it. She thought the shaft was called testicle, and the testicles were scientifically known as balls. Our teacher attempted to correct her, but she argued back, insisting the teacher was wrong. I often wonder where she is now. Story 7. My student's mother had an issue with me teaching that a lion is a cat. She tried to correct me at the Parent-Teacher Association meeting. Story 8. A very sweet woman who worked for me 40 years ago missed out on common sense. One day, I had the television on in the studio, and there was a program on the History Channel about digging up dinosaur bones. She asked me, Why didn't people domesticate dinosaurs the way they did dogs? I explained that humans have only been around for about 200,000 years, while dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. She thought about it for a moment and said indignantly, "They show them together in the movies." Story 9. This girl, Tammy, I went to high school with, constantly did the most foolish things I've ever seen. One time, she realized she missed her interstate exit when she saw the sign for the next exit. So she pulled into the emergency lane and backed up for 4 miles. Then she realized she couldn't back over the overpass, so she tried to back down the on-ramp. That's when the state trooper, who had been watching her for miles from the other side, finally stopped her. She was frequently pregnant. The children are not very bright either. It is just a situation of poverty and poor choices. I know her parents, and they are nice, successful people. They are so ashamed of her. I feel bad for them. Story 10. I was helping a girl log into her account on her phone. She couldn't remember her password, so I asked her if her password was case sensitive. She removed the case from her phone and tried again. Story 11. He is a nice guy but not very bright. I had to explain his simple job to him in detail every shift. He would often walk directly in front of passing cars at one workplace. I tried to help him get a job he applied for at my current workplace. I was honest with my boss about what to expect, but emphasized that he is a nice person and can be trusted to work as a security guard in a low-effort area. He showed up for his interview and was asked to wait outside while another candidate was interviewed. He became anxious and kept knocking on the door to be interviewed and introduce himself again. My boss just couldn't. Story 12. I worked with a man on an offshore oil platform in the northeast of Scotland. He had previously been on fishing boats, and the boat he was on had started taking on water. The skipper sent out a mayday call, and some of the crew got into a life raft. That left this man, the skipper, and one other person in the wheelhouse of the fishing vessel. The Coast Guard was on their way, and they were trying to remain on the boat as long as possible. Eventually, the skipper conceded that it was time to put on their immersion suits and enter the water. This man put on his immersion suit and entered the water. No sooner had he entered than he started getting dragged down. Nothing he did kept him afloat, so after a brief struggle, he made peace with his fate and stopped fighting. As he slowly began to descend towards his impending death, a hand reached down and grasped him, pulling him to the surface. That hand belonged to a Coast Guard diver from Norway. When we asked this man why he thought he went down so quickly, he proudly replied, "Well, no one told me to zip up the suit." This man terrified me for years on that platform with his foolish ideas and outrageous life-endangering actions. I have often thought about finding that Norwegian Coast Guard diver to express my frustration. Story 13. I worked at a local television station with a colleague named John. One of his tasks was to produce a commercial for a sandwich shop in town. Their logo featured the name of the shop positioned between 2 slices of bread, creating the visual impression that the name was the meat and fixings of the sandwich. The words were supposed to slide onto the screen from the side while the bread animated up and down from the top and bottom. John arranged the elements so the shop's name was about half the size of the bread, resulting in a sideways H appearance. I pointed out that it looked out of proportion, but he insisted it was correct. "John," I said, "look at your shirt." He happened to be wearing a t-shirt from the sandwich shop displaying their logo right on his chest. Yet, he still insisted that his version, with the tiny shop name surrounded by 2 enormous slices of bread, was acceptable. The client was understandably upset, and we agreed to redo the commercial at no charge. Story 14. My most recent ex wanted to make dinner. She tried to direct me to make the decision for her, but she eventually settled on one of those soup-in-a-bag situations. For background, I usually did all the cooking. I left the kitchen to let her handle it while I had other things to do around the house. I came back in about 10 minutes to grab a beer and saw that she had taken out my 8-quart Instant Pot, boiled 8 quarts of water, and thrown the soup mix in. It looked pretty anemic as a soup. I checked the instructions and saw her mistake. I asked if she followed the recipe. She said she did, to the letter. The instructions were, boil 8 cups of water, put mix in, and boil for 20 minutes. I asked her why she used quarts instead of cups. She denied it and insisted, "I followed the instructions exactly." I pointed out that she was using 8 quarts of water rather than cups. She then said, "I didn't know there was a difference between cups and quarts." She is in her mid-30s. We had a measuring cup. We had the internet. I was so dumbfounded by the lying and incompetence. Couldn't believe it. It was just weaponized incompetence at its best. Story 15. He was 20 years old and read at a second grade level. He once said that races should not mix unless the father is black, or else the children will be unattractive. He was of mixed race himself. Story 16. A coworker didn't want to get his girlfriend pregnant, so he slipped a birth control pill into her burger. Story 17. I had a coworker who didn't drink cheer wine because she believed it contained alcohol. I explained to her that it is a soda and is free of alcohol, which is why you can buy it without an ID and find it in vending machines where children can access it. She insisted it contained alcohol because it had wine in the name, all while drinking ginger ale. Story 18. My father told me he couldn't do any stretching exercises because he takes muscle relaxants. He's afraid that if he stretches, he might overstretch his tendons and they won't return to normal. Story 19. Ask anyone who has ever gone to basic training. There's always one person from Alabama, typically around 18 years old, who is already missing a fair number of teeth and cannot read. As his squad mate, you find yourself having to teach him how to shower and shave without cutting himself, unless you want to spend extra time doing push-ups. Additionally, he holds some questionable views and sneaks food into his footlocker from the dining facility. It's also likely that he will behave inappropriately at some point. When you finally graduate and are given some free time, he will likely end up at a strip club, convinced that the dancer is interested in him. She is not. Story 20. I once had a college roommate who, if he spilled something on his shirt, would spray stain remover on the stain and then throw it directly into the dryer. No washing machine, no scrubbing of the stain. Story 21. He introduced himself as Steve when I got to the boat while in the Navy. He was not very bright. However, this isn't an inappropriate thread, and many stories about Steve involved mishaps that included heat, electricity, or chemicals that aggravated the skin. Story 22. I had a friend in information technology who was called to help someone change her password. He changed it to orange. She asked him how to spell it, saying, "Orange like the fruit or orange like the color?" Story 23. My cousin's sister-in-law is Australian and married to an Australian man with German parents. We were all on vacation together once, hanging out by the pool when, all of a sudden, she became very quiet and serious, which was unusual for her. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "Those kids are speaking German." I was taken aback and asked for clarification. She expressed her frustration that children of around 5 years old could speak the language, while she could not. She mentioned that she listens very hard to her in-laws when they are together a few times a year, but she still doesn't understand the German language. She also remarked on the unpleasant smell of the environment. Story 24. I worked with a girl who lived on pizza and pretzels. I think she affected her brain cells with that diet. We worked in a bank, and a man would come in with large bags of change. She would get halfway through counting it and accidentally clear the machine. That meant the entire count had to be redone. After 3 times, he refused to let her help him. She sent a dog biscuit to a woman in the drive-thru with a dog that had beautiful golden fur. She sent it out and said it was for the passenger. The dog turned to look, and it was a woman. Story 25. I hurt my wrist moving boxes and heavy items, so I wore an over-the-counter brace. I needed to let my wrist rest for a day or two, and then it should be better for ordinary use. The person involved was a colleague at my workplace. She was a native English speaker, so there was no language confusion. It is worth noting that wearing a wrist brace did not affect my work at all and sparked conversations about how my weekend went. She insisted that I couldn't know my wrist was injured without an X-ray to confirm. Even when I assured her that I was quite certain it wasn't broken, she could not understand or accept that a person could self-diagnose their own pain. She believed that one could not claim to be in pain without a doctor's examination to diagnose the existence of that pain, and that X-rays were the standard method for diagnosing general pain. She was a college professor. Another acquaintance insisted that genetically modified food was exactly the same as non-genetically modified food, even when examined at the molecular level, but better. Essentially, they argued that two things could be identical in every way, yet one could be superior. Additionally, this person claimed that a certain hand cream could contain more than 100% water, meaning it could have more water than an equally sized container. This individual was in university and eventually graduated in a science-related field. Story 26. In the 1990s, I had a temporary job with the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense in the dockyard in Portsmouth. The administrative person was named Gillian. Gillian was, shall we say, stuck in her ways and did very little, and what she did was not very effective. On this particular day, I knew that my manager had a couple of letters to send to the HMS Floaty boat, which was berthed a few hundred meters away and due to sail for the Mediterranean that evening. I decided to drop off those letters at the gangway on my way home, which would only require a few minutes' detour. Gillian stopped me, stating that mail had to be delivered by the internal mail service. I explained that if we left it to the mail service, it would be too late, and HMS Floaty boat would have already sailed. The following discussion was a bit complicated, but the outcome was that it became clear Gillian, despite having worked there for years, had not understood that the Royal Navy routinely moves its ships around. Honestly, with one fewer brain cell, we would have had to water her along with the other pot plants. Story 27. A coworker decided he did not want to work at the beginning of COVID. He called out with a temperature of 109 degrees Fahrenheit. He then walked into the store to hang out. Story 28. Sadly, they are relatives. I live on a farm and we hired them for 1 year. The guy had never done a day of hard labor in his life due to a sheltered upbringing, which is not entirely his fault. One day, he was crouched down swinging a hammer at a roll pin and missing terribly. He was never coordinated, but I couldn't believe it was that bad. I watched him and noticed something. I asked him, "Are you left-handed?" He said, "No." I asked, "Why don't you switch hands?" He responded with, "How?" I had to show him how to stand up and reposition his body to use his right arm to swing the hammer. Thank goodness that boy never got into real trouble. Story 29. I told my ex that I needed money for the electricity bill, and he asked why he should help. I replied that our infant son lives here, it's cold, and he could die without electricity. This fool said, "My son is a baby. He can't even use that much electricity." I have not been able to get over how ridiculous that statement is. Story 30. A coworker at a group home I was working in was asked to make a couple of frozen pizzas for dinner. She fiddled around in the kitchen for a bit while I was doing something else in the adjacent room, then came to me and told me she started the pizzas but wasn't sure if the temperature was right because the boxes didn't say what the oven should be set to. So I dropped whatever I was doing and went to the kitchen with her, expecting to just look at the box, but it wasn't on the counter or in the trash. It turned out she had just stacked both wrapped pizzas in the oven, boxes and plastic wrap included. Thankfully, they hadn't been in there for very long, so they were still salvageable. The boxes, of course, both had simple written instructions and a good-sized picture of an oven with 400 degrees, written in bold letters on the front. Story 31. I've told this story before, but here we go again. I was a contract IT professional providing support for a medical institution. There is a type of PhD researcher we called wall bumpers. These are people who know everything about, say, the human genome, but can't be trusted to put on matching socks without guidance. One day, we received a call about a researcher who had a virus on his state-of-the-art Pentium workstation. We arrived at the office and he had completely disassembled the system, pulling out RAM modules and even removing the heatsink and CPU from the motherboard, ruining both in the process. I stopped him as he was trying to remove the network adapter without taking out the retaining screw. When we incredulously asked why he would do this, he said, and I quote, "I needed to look for signs of viral infection on the chips." A good reminder that the person who graduates at the bottom of the medical class is still called doctor. Story 32. My choice is my sister. She had her first child at 15, barely got her general educational development certificate, and reads at an elementary grade level. She has asked me a lot of foolish questions, but the one that stands out was when I received a text asking, "Where does the air inside a house come from?" She was around 21 at the time. Her husband is no better. We had her family over for the 4th of July a few years ago, and he confidently told us about an article he saw claiming that the vaccine was doing something to people. He mentioned that a woman scanned her arm with a pet chip reader and it came up numbers. He looked at us so concerned, and my partner couldn't help but laugh at him. I also noticed that people are discussing how having an education is equated with being smart. I had a physician I used to visit who believed that a patient could not know what was wrong with them. What she said had to be correct, and she was not above ranting loudly in the waiting room to the staff about how foolish people were and that she was the one with the degree. I witnessed this firsthand. A few years ago, I started experiencing recurrent urinary tract infections. I visited her about 5 times in 6 months, and she kept prescribing me the same medication that wasn't working, dismissing me each time. I finally had enough and requested to switch doctors after one of her tirades. Due to the embarrassment, they switched me immediately. Suddenly, during my first visit with the new doctor, she sent in an order for me to see a urologist, and we discovered that I was resistant to the medication the previous doctor had prescribed. I can now manage my urinary tract infections on my own with supplements after going through a different treatment. Story 33. My brother, while exceptionally intelligent in his area of expertise, is not skilled in other endeavors. His field encompasses a very limited scope of knowledge. He also confuses education with intelligence. Story 34. I worked with a woman named Patricia. Her reputation for being unwise was so well known that her nickname was Patricia. Story 35. I had a stepmother in the 1990s. I agreed to do some work for her at a rate of $10 per hour. I worked for 5 hours. After 2 hours and using a calculator, she still could not figure out how much she owed me. Even when my dad told her the amount, she could not understand. Story 36. I work for a university, and in my first role, I had to answer general student queries. A student emailed us with a complaint about an essay writing website, stating that she hired them but was not satisfied with their work, and they do not want to refund her money. She attached screenshots of the transaction and the communication. Story 37. I was 15 and walking home from school. A girl from my class was walking with me, and when she noticed some cracks in the asphalt, she said, "Can you imagine? Those could have been formed during the Ice Age." First, I thought she was joking, but no. Story 38. My best friend, Buddy, watched a video about getting girls. I had to sit him down and explain that it's about manipulation and gaslighting. Oh, that's bad. Buddy took out a credit card to impress his girlfriend's family. He borrowed $10,000 and had to pay back $20,000. Buddy is cool and has a good heart, but his cognitive skills are rather minimal. Story 39. I never actually met her, but my old roommate's boss wouldn't let him send a scan of her driver's license to secure a website because she thought her medical records were stored on her license and could be accessed via the scan. That is unfathomably stupid. Story 40. A former coworker could not understand why the balloons she inflated with air would not float. Story 41. I was dating a lovely girl when I was a late teenager. She couldn't drive and listen to music at the same time. She would start singing along and completely lose track of where she was. After the 3rd accident in a few months, her new Jaguar had a hole where the radio used to be. Her parents made the right decision. She would cheat by having a small radio in her lap while driving. I guess she wasn't as dangerous when she wasn't surrounded by sound. Story 42. I tutored a junior in high school once. He didn't know that 25% was $0.25. He couldn't provide any square roots of perfect squares, even after they were written down in front of him. He also didn't know how to read an analog clock. I spent 3 hours helping him study, but he spent 3 hours trying to convince me to do his homework for him. That was not going to happen. Story 43. My uncle is in his 50s. He is so socially unaware that he believes everyone who smiles at him or engages in small talk is truly a good person. He will die on that hill. Yes, your stepmother is so good and genuine that she forgot to invite any of us for Christmas for the past 4 years. Not even when we asked them to come over. But I don't mind that. I don't like Christmas. That's not the point. But she is always nice to me, and I don't mind it. When my grandmother was dying, literally just a few hours left, he insisted that her cousins-in-law should come. They have the right to know. They should know. My grandmother said she didn't want them there. I came to her defense. She is the one dying. She gets to decide, and she said no. Yes, I think they deserve to know. They should know. Crying, my grandfather said, well, I don't know how to tell them either. Perhaps they should. My grandmother never trusted them or even liked them much. I had to rush to her home to grab her wig, to at least make sure she didn't feel humiliated in her last moments. All because this person decided they should know. Those same people planned to help my grandfather and ended up stealing money, my grandmother's perfumes, and who knows what else they could take. Yet he is still dying on that hill. They are good people. Really. Story 44. A couple of things come to mind from middle and high school, which was a few decades ago. The first was when I went with my mother to a parent-teacher conference in middle school. While waiting in the hallway to see the teacher, another teacher stopped to chat with us. He told my mother a story about how earlier that day he had a student make a joke about Christopher Columbus's ship being made out of candy. Another girl heard this and wrote it down as a test answer. He also told us about another girl that day who unlocked her locker, relocked it, climbed inside, and then pulled the door shut. Her friends then went to get the teacher to help. The teacher asked the girl what her combination to the lock was. While crying, she yelled through the closed locker door, "I forgot." A few years later, we were discussing a war in our high school history class. The teacher told the class that we dropped a certain number of bombs during this war, and each bomb cost a specific amount of money. The same girl from the locker story raised her hand and asked if the bombs cost so much, why didn't we just drop one? Story 45. A young lady coworker said, "Men can have it. I don't want rights." It is sad and disappointing to hear this from someone who is expected to be part of the future. Story 46. While describing a lanolin-based salve I mentioned it is similar to what you would use on udders. A coworker asked me what udders are. I told them and they responded, "Well, how would I know? I'm not a farmer." Whenever they needed to find files in our project management software, they would claim I didn't upload my portion, and I would have to take a screenshot of where it was saved, circle it in red, and send it to them. They also had numerous spelling errors everywhere, even though their work was very public-facing. Despite this, all they needed to do was copy and paste the text I wrote. I'm not convinced they knew how to do that. It felt like a real lights on, but no one is home situation. Story 47. My coworker is a third or fourth generation overseas Chinese who is staunchly pro-China, even though he doesn't live there. He often complains about how his motherland has been treated unfairly throughout history, such as during the Opium Wars, claiming that the Western world is trying to bully Asian countries. He advocates for boycotting American products in favor of Chinese ones. One day, as he reiterated that boycott idea, I calmly pointed to his shirt and asked, "Why are you wearing a Nike top with that large logo on it?" The look on his face during that aha moment was priceless. Story 48. I went on a road trip with a friend and our girlfriends several years ago. After a bit of day drinking, we returned to our hotel to relax. My friend said he had a bad headache and needed to hydrate, so he was going to take a shower. We asked him why he needed to shower to hydrate. It turns out he believed the human body could absorb moisture through the skin in sufficient quantities to satisfy thirst. Story 49. My mother. I'll give 3 examples. Example 1. Taking college classes at a community college. I have class on Monday and Thursday. It's Wednesday. Mother asks me why I'm not going to class today. I say, "My classes are on Monday and Thursday." She responds, "I know. Why aren't you going to class today?" I ask, "What day is today?" She replies, "It's Wednesday." She looks confused, goes to the calendar, and studies it for a minute. She asks, "So why aren't you going to class today?" Example 2. I see my mother repeatedly tapping the screen on the laptop she is using. I walk over to see what she is doing. I inform her that tapping the screen with her finger won't do anything because it's not a touch screen like her tablet. She stares at the laptop screen confusedly for a few seconds. She resumes trying to tap the screen with her finger. Example 3. I ask, "Hey mom, which do you think is bigger, the sun or the moon?" She thinks carefully for a few seconds and says, I don't know. I would say probably they're equal. That was the level of intellect involved in every interaction I have ever had with her. Story 50. I was helping a driver who got stuck in the snow. He had a Jeep and thought he could drive anywhere. He was walking back to town when I drove past him. Just by the look on his face, I could tell he was in trouble. I stopped, and he said his car was stuck while his girlfriend stayed with the vehicle. I had him hop in, and I drove up a single-lane dirt road to find his car. I was driving an older Isuzu Trooper. His Jeep was much heavier than mine, but he was not as stuck as he thought. I dug out the tires and used the old emergency brake half-on trick, and it drove right out. As we were getting ready to leave, another vehicle came down the road and crashed against a rock on the side, blocking our only way out. There was a very narrow strip of road usable with a steep drop-off on the other side. I decided to tow my new friend past, as my vehicle was narrow and could pass the stuck car first, then pull him along if he started to slip. So the setup was a single-lane snow-packed ice, covered road with me in an Isuzu towing a Jeep. As I approached the stuck vehicle, the person driving it was standing next to the car's door. I got a bit closer, but she didn't move. When I got close enough to yell, I said, "Don't stand there." Still not moving. She said, "I'm not stupid." I had to stop before she would move. I think of her often. Story 51. My manager believes that if he works very hard and makes everyone's life difficult, the corporation will notice him and promote him. Story 52. A neighbor once hired a local person to move a huge pile of garden soil. He left the young man with a nice wheelbarrow and a shovel, telling him he would check back at the end of the day. When he returned, he found the dirt pile was gone, and he now had a 12-foot wide hole about 5 feet deep in the yard. Needless to say, it was backfilled the next day. Strangely, the digger went on to become an accountant, as he had a way with numbers. Story 53. I completed my basic training with a man named Clark, who mistakenly spelled his name as Claire on his locker. He had to wear an eye patch while shooting because he couldn't close one eye. When we were at the target area on the range, the corporal instructed him to run up and down the sandbank that caught the bullets. He almost made it before getting tackled. In the end, he was discharged for being too incompetent for the army. I didn't think that was possible. Story 54. I saw a man smoking at a gas station once. I said something to him and he pointed to his toes. He was on the correct side of a pavement crack, meaning he wasn't technically in the gas station, as though physics mattered. Story 55. My son's mother's family had a particularly negative impact on her. She believed that drinking cold water would help her lose weight because it required calories to heat it. Unfortunately, she died from obesity-related causes. Story 56. My upstairs neighbor claimed that a cure for cancer has been found but is being suppressed. When I asked him why, he seemed surprised and said it was so new medical research facilities could be constructed. The conversation began when I requested a donation for my fundraising event, the Weekend to End Breast Cancer. He contributed $20 and wrote on the donation form, "Start curing chronic fatigue syndrome," as he suffers from this condition. Story 57. A lady came into Jersey Mike's, where I worked for a summer, and I asked if she wanted a giant sub. She asked how big that was, and I said it was a foot long. She proceeded to argue with me, insisting she wanted a 12-inch sub, not a foot long. Story 58. I won't go into all the backstory. I get tired just thinking about typing it. However, my coworker is, I believe, a sociopath. Not someone who kills people, mind you, but someone who thrives on making other people miserable. We no longer work together, but I'm sure she is still awful. One evening, she picked a ridiculous fight with me, and then went shouting to our supervisor that I was being unfair to her. We worked in a remote location, 7 days on and 7 days off. Before leaving work at the end of her shift, she filled out a timesheet for the following shift. That timesheet indicated that she was out sick. When she didn't come into work, she failed to answer multiple calls from our supervisor inquiring about her. It was only a couple of days later that they found the completed timesheet indicating illness. What was her illness, you ask? She was so distraught about how I treated her that she just couldn't come into work. Notice that she knew this 10 or 11 days before she had to return to work. In fact, the fight was on a Friday night. She did not leave for the normal end of her shift until Tuesday morning. She did not return to work for 3 or 4 shifts beyond the first missed shift, claiming she was having major dental work. We all enjoyed her ill health, and she did not look guilty at all. Story 59. I had a student ask me if there was any typing in a class on typography. Later, that same student wanted me to show him how to illegally obtain the software from the lab's Mac computers to run on his PC at home. He didn't last long. Story 60. I wrote a comment about an ex of mine, criticizing her speech patterns in detail. I realized, in retrospect, that those patterns were so ridiculous they were almost poetic. I found this amusing after looking at old messages. After posting the comment, I revisited those texts for another laugh, but what stood out this time were the kind messages she sent after our breakup. She wished me well and expressed genuine hope for the future. Honestly, I probably didn't deserve that. No, I didn't, and I likely still don't. Though it may not matter to anyone, I deleted the comment because she didn't deserve that kind of treatment, and it was low of me to post it. It was funny, but also too harsh and personal. So I changed my answer. The stupidest person I ever met lives in the mirror, and this is his story. Anyway, sorry. Story 61. She was an old coworker. The woman, who was 20 at the time, went to a bar with the rest of our colleagues. I guess they were regulars there because they didn't even question her. Months passed, and she was finally turning 21. This individual decided to celebrate her birthday at the same bar they had been visiting. A little context. Most bars do not allow entry to people under the age of 21. Some bars do allow entry but require individuals to identify themselves as underage, while others outright forbid it. Eventually, they were banned from returning. The funniest part is that the person who informed me expected me to agree with them, as if the bar was in the wrong. What? Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.